right, we should be good to go.
Welcome to the Psyched to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. Thank you for joining us. Paul and I are excited to have a Masters in Practice episode today and talking about executive functions.
And, this one was just so full of just such practical, interventions to use throughout the conversation. I'm just typing away at a page of notes and executive functioning it's a topic that I talk about a lot. And the way that Justin was able to really take in this content and really create a process that just feels so fluid and the success that he has with his clients, it makes so much sense why, he really kind of has it down to a science.
Yeah, so this was really an honor for me. So, Justin Rubenstein was an actual school psychology student when I taught full time, and got to work with him early in his career. And it's just so exciting to see the stuff he's kind of put together and the program he's developed. This was a fun episode. For those that maybe don't know Justin, Justin Rubenstein has 20 years of experience helping children and families. He is in the state of Pennsylvania, is a school psychologist and also a nationally certified school psychologist. And his specialties are ADHD, anxiety, educational advocacy, and concussion management. In addition to owning Solutions for Education, which is his practice that does much of this executive function work we talked about, Justin also works as an administrator in a public school district.
From hearing all of the different interventions, I find I'm going to take a lot of it and apply it, and hope you're able to take this and apply it in the same way that I'm excited to.
Yeah, great practical information, which is always makes a fun episode to really just bring these sometimes abstract concepts to life. So it was a great episode. And for those of you listening, join us on social media. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode and maybe some interventions that we didn't talk about that you'd like to share.
We hope you enjoy this Masters in Practice episode, Becoming an Educational Detective, Executive Functioning Strategies That Work.
So Justin, thanks for joining us for the Psyched to Practice podcast. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me to join. It's an awesome honor.
Yeah, well, so it's, a little blast from the past for me. So Justin and I go way back. So I knew him as a grad student, which really, makes me feel old. The fact that you have gray hair now too, though, does make me feel a little better, right? So Justin, we're gonna, we're glad to have you talking with us about executive functions today. But I want to kind of start. Maybe you can tell our listeners a little bit about how you got into school psychology, and then how did you start specializing in working with individuals that need supports around executive function skills?
Yeah. So, first of all, for our listeners, Ray was a 22-year-old doctor, guy with a doctorate. So, it wasn't quite, he's not quite that old. But
I don't know.
Yeah. So as far as school psychology goes, getting out of college, I majored in psychology and truly had no idea what I wanted to do with it. I was interested in counseling, but I wasn't sure if that's all I wanted to do. I liked schools, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do in that realm. And so I cold called someone that worked for my local school district who happened to be a school psychologist. Wow. And I said to him, what is a school psychologist? In our undergraduate program, they didn't really get into that. And, the way he described it to me was so interesting. He could have described it, I think, a lot of different ways, but he said, we're kind of like educational detectives. There are problems, there are kids that are struggling, there are really hard situations, and we have to use data in order to figure out and help teams, families, and kids figure out what is at the root of the problem so that we can then design interventions to help. And that was very intriguing to me. Educational detective sounded really cool. It sounded like it should be a TV show.
Right.
But no, I mean, that's really what got me the wheels in motion for me to start researching really more about school psychology. And the more I looked into it, the more I felt like it was a really good fit for my love of education and also my love of psychology. And then, from there, just researching grad programs and figuring it out from there.
So, as you've kind of moved through, and I know you've been a school psychologist, you work as an administrator, and then you started doing work in executive function. So how did that come about?
Yeah. So, historically speaking, my executive functioning is not strong. No, truly. And people laugh when I say that, but it's actually, it's very, very true. And so from a very young age, I had to learn a little bit differently. And from a very young age, I'm not someone who could just commit everything to memory or kind of make things up as I go and fall by the wayside. So I've had to learn throughout my entire life very intentional strategies for my executive functioning to help me stay organized, to help me stay on track, to learn how to study properly. And even to this day, there are many different systems that I use to basically be a fully functioning adult that without those systems, I'd be struggling hard. So that's really what started my interest in executive functioning. And then in the school psych grad program that I was in, there was a heavy emphasis on school neuropsychology. And we really took a deep dive into, what really are executive functions. And that's when it really started to click that's what I had been experiencing my whole life. It probably wasn't up until that point that the light bulb really went off. And from there, when I think about, achieving at a high level, when I think about maximizing your potential, there's no way anybody can do that unless they have either really strong executive functioning or they have strategies to help work through or accommodate their executive functioning. And so that's, learning more about that, learning how it played out for me personally, and then learning how that can really help individuals access their higher order reasoning, access their higher level problem solving and abilities was really intriguing to me.
Yeah. So let's kind of, before we get into maybe working with individuals, when we hear the term executive function, there's all these different models out there. There's, I think everybody I've seen some models that have 5 executive functions, and I've seen some that have 40 executive functions. And so when you're talking about executive function, what's that mean? What are the skills that you're looking at?
Yeah, so it's funny you say that because you're right. Like if you Google it, they'll come up with dozens upon dozens of different areas of functioning. When I look at it, especially when I'm thinking about it in terms of educational functioning, I'm really looking at people's ability to pay attention, to plan, to organize, to be able to switch in between tasks and expectations fluidly. To be able to regulate their emotions, right? To be able to flexibly problem solve, and to be able to, handle the myriad of tasks that may be coming at them at once and how they sort that out, how they're able to kind of parse things out. So I know that's kind of a very simplistic explanation of executive functioning and neuropsychology in and of itself. But to me, those are the things that are real demonstrable, that when individuals are having difficulties with that, they're undoubtedly going to have difficulty as they're getting older. So as they approach about 4th grade and then beyond, and they're going to continue to have difficulties unless they learn strategies to build skills to help them manage those things.
And I'm so happy, like the way you're describing this, and especially like the high achieving individuals having great executive functioning. And that's a comment. My own version of that same comment comes up often in session when I'm working with, range from kiddos to adults who are just kind of identifying the potential for ADHD or other areas that are impacting executive functioning. And the comment I like to use is like, willpower, we really glorify willpower. It's like, oh, it's this wonderful thing. It's like, it's good executive functioning. It's like when someone is able to maintain concentration, when they're able to persevere through distractions, when they're able to really prioritize something and keeping it in focus. I'm like that. That's all executive functioning. And so how do we work to develop those skills when they don't come easily. And I really hear that's what you're looking to do in the school system, and also tailoring it in a way to make sure it's not just a one size fits all, but rather how do you actually hear those pieces and making sure it really fits for the kiddos that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And one of the things that I see, unfortunately, more often than not in my practice, I encounter this a lot, are when people are coming to me, a lot of times they're frustrated, they're not doing well in school, and they feel dumb. And undoubtedly, one of the first things that we do is dispel all of that and really go through that psychoeducation piece as to why they feel that they're experiencing these different challenges, and really highlight the fact that no, they're not incapable, or they don't have lower abilities and skills. It's just that their brain doesn't naturally help them to access some of those things. It doesn't come as natural. And normalizing that for people, and also helping them to understand that, no, you are very capable. We just need to build some skills to help you to get there, is really impactful for a lot of the kids that I see.
And when you're describing that, it's so fun. There's an individual I work with. I was working with him and he's like, I just feel really dumb. And it's like, okay, hey, I was looking over your value. Let's pull something up. And pulled up his IQ, and he had an IQ. It was 114. I was like, okay, do we understand what this means here? And he was bullying too. And it's like, oh, well, they just think I'm stupid. That I take longer, and we're recognizing again. I love how you said it, dispelling some of those preconceived notions, and really helping to create this better understanding of what executive functioning is and the role that it plays. And I'm curious for you, when you're talking about some of the psychoeducation pieces, what are those areas that you really work to highlight when you're working with someone new?
No, it's a great question. So, my first session is all about building relationships, but doing so in a very purposeful way, while also assessing for what their strengths and weaknesses are. And then, my second session, we have a goal, and that's where we do a lot of the psychoeducation. So I pull up a diagram of the brain. It's a more simplistic diagram. I ask people what they know about it. Some people have a foundational knowledge, some don't. And then we go into talking about just the different areas of the brain in a very global context. And I give a very simplistic explanation, but then I always come back to the frontal lobe, right? And the executive functions are housed in the frontal lobe. I give that explanation. I'll use the conductor of the orchestra analogy a lot of times, because that tends to make sense to people. And then we'll talk about, how that affects their ability. So weaknesses in some of those areas affect their ability to take that information in, store it in long-term memory, and then use it later when they need to. That process, I explained to them, it's not that you can't do these things. It's just that for whatever reason, your brain doesn't function as fluidly throughout that process. And I always, personalize it too, and dispel again the idea that, because I'm working with them, all of a sudden I have excellent executive functioning, or successful people all have great executive functioning, and they don't. And we talk about that. And we talk about that. Listen, I can give you examples from all walks of life of people that are highly successful, that they don't need a whole lot of strategies because their brain just does that naturally, and tons of successful people where it doesn't happen as naturally. And it really doesn't matter, because all of us have a constellation of strengths and weaknesses. It's more about a matter of knowing what those specific areas are that don't come as naturally, so that we can then learn and build those skills, to help with that. And so that's a lot of what we do. And then we do isolate what the individualized and specific areas of executive functioning those individuals are having more difficulty with. Because as we know, executive functioning is a very broad term. It's not a one size fits all. And there are many, many people that have a very different set of challenges related to executive functioning.
Yeah, Justin, I want to kind of jump back. So you said something before we were talking about the psychoeducation, about your first session is this relationship building. And, one of the things I find with individuals that struggle in these areas is, by the time I see them, they're frustrated. They're already to a point where they don't believe there's anybody that can help. There's already that, they're just going to tell me what to do, and I'm just not going to be able to get it done. So I think that relationship piece just is such an important starting point. And sometimes we jump too soon into the intervention without that. Tell us a little bit, what's that process of that first session like? Like, how do you get that connection so that they're going to trust that you're the person to help them?
No, that's a great question. So I like to put people's idea of what they're coming into and put it in a blender. So people have a very preconceived idea of what this may look like. They may have been to other executive functioning coaches or therapists in the past. And you're right, Ray. They come oftentimes very frustrated by either other experiences through that or their experiences in school. And so I initially will figure out, I'll ask the parents usually beforehand, some things that the child's interested in. And undoubtedly, if they're interested in dogs, I will bring my dog to the first session, which is great. I just did it the other day. That's a great tool in helping to kind of break down some of those walls. But I think a lot of it comes from, the way I interact with kids, and really normalizing the experiences that they're going through. Often, like you said, they're frustrated when they're coming. They think that they're the only ones that are struggling maybe as much as they are. And sure. I give them, real world examples of, hey, listen, like I bet you're really frustrated. But I can assure you that, if you're willing to commit, you're going to see yourself make tremendous progress. And I'll give case examples of real people that I'm working with, obviously with no names or identifying information, but, I'll give them that example and say, listen, like I had, and these are real examples. Like I have a couple teenagers that their first time, I could tell by the way they were looking at me, they're like, there's no way this is going to work. And, through getting them to buy in through humor, through, talking to them about like myself, my experiences, other people I've worked with, they were able to commit a little bit. And the second they started to see progress, that's when they took off. And that's when, I didn't really need to do any more with buy-in because they were feeling that progress that they were making. So, that relationship factor is huge, right? But one of the things I also feel very strongly about is, I know that there are some people out there that relationship building could take like 2 or 3 sessions. And I always tell families, I said, obviously the relationship's going to take time, but I'm not here to waste your time or money either. So by the end of the first session, we will absolutely have a goal area that we're going to focus on. And again, that first session is light. I bring my dog if I can. We'll play games, we'll play cards, we'll throw a ball. But the whole time, I'm not only asking silly questions about like their favorite food, their favorite color. I'm encouraging them to ask questions about me, but I'm also folding in those more important questions about why they're here, right? What are you experiencing in school? What do you feel are your strengths? What are areas that you feel you can improve on? Why? How do you go about studying? What does that look like? How do you keep track of your assignments and how do you manage yourself? So the entire time in that first session, I'm folding those questions in with obviously other questions. And that's really how I can accomplish both the relationship building piece and the assessment piece.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I'm glad you kind of threw that in there because I think sometimes, it's almost like we're going through an interrogation instead of a conversation. And, that idea of, I think that's the art of psychology, this idea that we can interweave purposeful questions with more entertaining and engaging questions. And when we do that, I think the outcome's always better. So that's great that you share that. So I'm just curious, how's the dog's executive function skills? Does he help with that, or is it just a mess? I don't know.
Well, it depends. I have 2 dogs, so it depends on which one. My older dog, he actually has pretty strong executive functions. The younger one, not so much.
Yeah. Well, they're 2 good case examples. So that's good.
It's true.
And so after like this, like the intake session, when you really are building this relationship, you're assessing, coming up with these tentative goals, then taking the time for psychoeducation and kind of hearing their knowledge base and really kind of dispelling some of those belief systems that they hold about themselves. Like, where do you then go from there? Like after the assessment, you're kind of like have hit that goal of psychoeducation. How do you then use the assessment to inform the next steps, do you feel, Justin?
Yeah. So what I find is that when people are coming to me for executive functioning work, whether they're, elementary school kids or college age kids, or I actually have some young adults too that I work with. I found that undoubtedly they think they may be using a good self-management system. They may have elements of that in place, but it's really, truly not effective for them. So that's usually my starting point is, what do you currently have in place, if anything? And how is that working for you? And I already know the answer to how it's working for them because they're coming to see me, right? But that's usually a big starting point of mine. How, what are we going to use? So on a day-to-day basis, you know what you have to get done and you've planned it out. And so I always say to kids and teenagers, like, you're going to think I'm crazy, but we're going to start with a paper and pencil agenda book. All right. I'm very particular on the kind of agenda book. I give them the guidelines and I say, listen, in your head, you're probably thinking this bald guy's an idiot. However, and you might be right. You might be right in some ways, but bear with me and humor me. And I promise you, I always make this promise because I truly believe it and I've seen it. If you stick to this and you do what we're saying, you're going to see your productivity go up and your stress level come down. And that's through like the data I keep. That's undoubtedly what happens when people are buying in. And so we usually start with a self-management system. And, it's not as simple as we'll write your assignments in your assignment book. I give them, there's a magic 3 steps that I work with people on. And they're pretty simple, but, believe it or not, they're pretty labor intensive in the beginning, especially for people that struggle with executive functioning. So, the step number 1 is, first of all, have them take all the tasks for the week that they've access to. And individually for each task, they write down the due date in their agenda book, right, on the due date. And then they estimate, they say to themselves, okay, how long do I think I'll need to prepare for this test or this project or this paper or what have you? And, I'll say this is obviously a rough estimate. And we talk about how to estimate. We talk about, is it an area, a subject of strength for them? Is it not? Do you need to allot more time if it's not a subject of strength? Is it a bigger assignment? Is there a short paragraph paper? What kind of task is it? So from there, they then estimate, okay, well, if I have a test on Friday in math, I know that that's an area that I need to pay more attention to. So I'm going to give myself 4 days to study for that. Cool. So they start with the due date, they put the due date in, and then they back up in their agenda book every day for the 4 days prior. And put math test tomorrow, then the day before, study for math tests. And they do that so that they've created a study plan that runs them right into the due date. Those 3 steps to me are so vital because 1, it's easy to make a mistake if you're not really careful with how you're logging that. But 2, what we're also teaching them is spaced practice, which is an evidence-based intervention for study skills, right? So I'm folding that spaced practice in while helping them to understand how to prioritize, how to plan, and how to organize themselves to be more successful.
So you're doing that actively in the session with them.
Yes.
And then I'm assuming there's some kind of carryover, like do you have parents then work with them on how to do that through the week? Or how's that go? Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. So one of the things, because the nature of the work that I'm often doing is not so confidential, I'll get buy-in early from kids and explain to them, listen, for anything confidential, you tell me, I'm not going to share that with parents. But a lot of the things we're doing are skill-based. And the only way this is going to work, the magic is not what we're doing here. It's what happens when you leave here. So I get that buy-in early to be able to share with parents. But after each session, I allot maybe the last 5 or 10 minutes and I bring the parent into the session and I have the kid teach the parent what we talked about so that then the parent understands the skills we're working on. And then I'll give them tips like, hey, at home this week, here's some things I'd like you to do and reinforce and let me know how it's going. So oftentimes I'm getting updates from parents throughout the week also via text message. Which definitely, and then I know that they're aware of what strategies to use. And that's how I've seen, really quick progress. And also the generalization of skills is really when the parents are carrying those skills over and reinforcing them at home.
So you mentioned that you start with a paper and pencil book, which is not what most people are used to. So I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask, Why? Why do you go back to the paper and pencil book with this population?
Yeah, so I think everyone is so used to technology in their phones, and there's a great place for that. But oftentimes, what I have found is that people aren't really using those tools properly, and I have come to believe that in order to really understand how to set up a self-management system well, it's best to do it through that paper and pencil book, because you have to be a lot more deliberate in what you're doing. You can't copy and paste. You can't you move a mouse and move things over. You have to be really intentional about what you're doing. And I always tell people, I said, listen, I'm not, from the Stone Ages, and I get the where technology and phones come into play, right? And we're not saying we're not going there. But if you can learn the basic tenets of the system using the paper and pencil agenda book, you can really apply that same those same steps to really anything. Any app on a phone, and I usually when we a lot of my clients, we do transition to a phone. So we get there, but the starting point in my mind is much more successful when we're using paper and pencil because of the need for that intentionality.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that, it oftentimes because I do something very similar with individuals, and the main reason is it creates a different presence with the content. It really brings almost a little bit of a mindfulness piece to it, where you do have to write letter by letter. There is this, that intentionality is so important. And, it's like, I tell people, it's like going to the gym. You got to get the process down first, right? You got to get really good at the movements and what they look like. Then you can get more advanced and you can maybe try other things, but you got to get that basic stuff down. So yeah, I think it's a great piece. I know a lot of kids that's tough to get to, but I appreciate those thoughts.
And I'm curious. So when you're talking about setting them up of we're jumping ahead to the due date and working backwards, especially for study skills. I find a lot of times that when we're getting to that point where they're aware of what's coming up, they don't always still feel like they have the skills to actually apply that. And most of the time, at least with the population I'm working with, it's not from a lack of ability, but rather, distraction and creating different environments. And I'm curious, is that the next step after they're developing the skill of being able to project ahead and externalizing things outside of I'll just remember I have a test, and undoubtedly, the test day comes and there's a test. But what's the step after that? Yeah.
So, the way I view and I say the agenda book, right? I'm so annoying with my people about the agenda book, but really I tell them this, I said, I'm going to be annoying about it. However, the reason isn't so much because I really am in love with a paper and pencil agenda book. The reason is that, in order to become independent with these things, the agenda book really is the vehicle by which to do that, right? So if we can get this down, we're going to fold in, like I talked about spaced practice before. Well, that's a natural study skill that we're building in using that agenda book as the vehicle. And then once they're understanding how to properly put things in there, and then, a lot of it, then, it's important they put it in there, but it doesn't matter if they're not going to refer to it and use it. So we use a lot of behavioral techniques in order to, build that behavior change in those habits in. And that's the part that actually takes more time. Well, as we know about behavior change, that does take time, but that's the part that's a bigger challenge with the people I'm working with. And that's what takes longer, is creating those habits and that behavior change to use what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then from there, we can fold in how to study. And so I will assess, after we start building in the self-management piece, then I'll really start assessing for how they're studying, how are they preparing. And we'll kind of go over that and build in some additional study skills as needed.
So when we were talking about kind of what executive functions are, you talked about all these other areas. So once you kind of take this initial step and you have this self-management approach, How do you then decide where do you go from there with it? Like, how do you pick which of the other skills you go? What's that sequence look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I obviously rely heavily on the parent and the child themselves to help really guide that. So I mean, it really depends. I mean, there are a number of kids that I work with that have decent study skills. The problem is self-management. So we just focus on that pretty heavily and building in those habits. Oftentimes, it's that they're struggling with self-management, with study skills, with follow-through, with habits. And then undoubtedly, I'm a firm believer. I don't believe that you can separate executive dysfunction from some sort of mental health or emotional component, right? And so we will address that. And I'll use cognitive behavioral techniques to really address the underlying emotionality or, mental health that is underlying, whether it's causing some of the executive dysfunction or whether it's just a byproduct of struggling more than someone, feels they should. Those are areas we often address as well. And I find that with that, what we'll start to see over time, and I always tell parents, because they always ask me, like, just out of curiosity, like, how long will this take? How many sessions? And I said, there's no magic ball, right? Or, there's no, there's no magic to it. It's hard to predict, but I can tell you that as soon as I start seeing a client start using it every day for a couple of weeks, and then when I start to see them, undoubtedly, when I have one of my clients say to me, you know what, this part's really working well for me, but I kind of want to try something different, in this way. Now I know that they have it. They're starting to generalize those skills. They're starting to see what works for them or not, and they're starting to put their own spin on it. That's when I know we're coming closer to, the end of some of the interventions. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on what the student's struggling with, and that comes with monitoring, session to session.
And as you're saying that, I realize I jumped ahead, but I want to kind of back up here for a moment. When you were talking about the importance of bringing the parent into the session, in a variety of ways, and I can't help but think, and I think, Ray, you were actually the one who was sharing to me, it's a specific parenting style that really improves executive functioning. And it's this, we're going along and we're participating actively with them. And so if it's cleaning up or if it's doing things, it's not just, hey, go clean up, but it's, hey, we're going to come over together and we're going to be picking these up and here's how we do it, and really demonstrating the skill. And so, you're demonstrating it in session, but the importance of taking that and, building the supportive environment with the parents as well. And, I find a lot of times that when I have some of those intake sessions where it is more of like hey, like, you're going to be working one-on-one, like it's so important to say, no, like this is going to be, yes, we're going to have one-on-one time, but we're also going to have parent sessions. We're going to have, sessions where we're all together to really make sure these skills are generalizing. And I guess, how do you work to inform parents of that? Like, is that, prior to the first session, or when is that really a conversation that you're having with them to let them know what their role is in these interventions?
Yeah. So I preset that as soon as they reach out to have a conversation with me. So all intakes I do over the phone. And when I go through kind of, who I am, my experience, what we do, I front load that. And and oftentimes what I'm finding is that parents they find that really refreshing. Other experience, they haven't had other experiences where they felt well informed, or where they really felt as an equal team member as part of that process. And so, I mean, the parent buy-in, for me, starts with that initial phone call. And, again, they find it really refreshing that that's the model that I operate under.
And I guess maybe a follow-up to that is oftentimes the individuals I'm working with that struggle with executive functioning is something that when I'm talking with their parents, they're also struggling with executive functioning. And so I can imagine, your skill building with the child, but also teaching, and I love that, having the child teach the parent the skill that you're working on can be such an effective piece. But do you notice, like, when you have that, the kiddo buying in and you're seeing them kind of take these skills and generalizing it or wanting to adapt them and make it their own, do you see that developing for the parents as well? Like it's almost step-in-step process then, not only for the child.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because it is interesting. There are a handful of parents that disclose to me when I'm working with their children that, they too struggle with executive functioning. So some of the parent sessions that I do are parents requesting, hey, can I meet with you to learn? So I'll do parent sessions sometimes separate from the child at parent request. And, a lot of those sessions are, how can I help my child? But it's also, what are some good tips for me to better manage myself so that I can also help my child, right? And so that's a really cool byproduct that, quite frankly, I didn't really anticipate. I didn't think that would be as much a part of the interventions that I would be working on. But it's been refreshing, because once I think families get to know me and get to see kind of my personality, and I have a very laid back approach with people, I think that they, feel more apt to disclose that they're struggling as well. So that's been a really cool byproduct that like I said, I hadn't anticipated.
Justin, you had, mentioned about, a little bit about this kind of intersection of mental health and executive function, like they kind of come together, not knowing which one comes first. Is it the executive functioning causing the emotionality or the emotionality causing executive functioning? But I'm just curious on your approach does it still always start with that self-management? So is that really like in your work, that's the foundation of where you start?
Oftentimes, yes. Yeah. It depends, right? Sometimes, families up front will talk about how the executive functioning, they're already aware of how the executive functioning may be affecting the mental health. A lot of times they're not aware of that. So, the self-management piece is usually the starting point, but then we start to uncover, more that's going on behind the scenes. And that's when we start really addressing, some of the mental health pieces as well.
I think that idea, and, a lot of times I don't think we talk about it, but I think that the power of self-management is control. I think it gives people a sense of accomplishment. It gives them a sense of feeling that they have something that they can hang on to. And in and of itself, I think is such a great mental health strategy that a lot of times when, no matter what comes first, I'm not sure it really matters, but I think that, what do we do to give people that sense that I'm accomplishing something? I can control this one little piece of my life. I have control of it.
Sure.
I think we underestimate that power. I think it's a great piece, because I think sometimes we jump into the emotion. And, as a therapist, I do that myself sometimes. But I find sometimes if I can back up and I can go, let's just focus on this one little thing. Like this one, let's not even get into the emotion part. Let's empower you to manage this part of life. It's a game changer sometimes. So I think that's great that, I think sometimes we overthink what should come first. And sometimes the easiest thing is giving a little bit of control or self-management or whatever we want to call. So do you see that piece, if you start with that, it'll automatically start impacting in a positive way the emotionality?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's that self-efficacy piece, right? When people have that, internal, feeling that they can accomplish goals and manage things themselves, you're absolutely right. They feel better about themselves. They feel more in control, and they're also seeing themselves be more productive, which is self-reinforcing. Absolutely. I find that that's the case for a large number of my clients.
And I'm curious, especially like with the age range that you work with, the role that motivation plays, especially when it comes to the follow through or the execution after the self-management. And I hear that the self-management piece, being able to be supported, whether that's in session or if it's in, at home with the parents. However, the execution of that, at least again, in the sessions I'm working with my clients, trying to talk about generating motivation. And I'm curious, is there any interventions that you have that help assist in the generation of motivation?
Yeah. So, Paul, I view motivation as a symptom as opposed to a cause. And so when I see someone with low motivation, I try to figure out, all right, well, why is that? What's going on to cause that? That really is what helps lead me to the interventions that I'll use, right? So I would say that in terms of motivation, I think it just varies, based upon what the individual is experiencing. And, but a lot of the things that I will do are, help them, again, along the self-management end, right, to your point about, trying to take care of that self-management end first. I'll have them do things like playing like different mind games with themselves. And they think I'm weird, but they think I'm weird anyway. So this fits the bill. But no, I have them use a lot of alarms and timers on their phones or on their watches or what have you. And we talk a lot about, okay, well, like, let's break down, different tasks that you may have to do, right? They're not going to be fun for you. And you just got to kind of play the game for now. So what if you do 2 tasks? Let's say you have 5 tasks to do, right? In a given night. Let's do 2 of those and then build in a break and set a timer for 25 minutes and take a break and do something fun and then finish the tasks up and then build in a break at the end that's bigger. So, and as a rule, when you're playing these mind games with yourself, create this mental rule where it says, I can't do anything until I get like these 2 tasks done. And kind of helping them to schedule that out, build in those reward breaks, if you will. That in and of itself, they find a little bit more motivating than looking at that pile of work or that mountain that's really, really hard to climb. And then again, once they start seeing themselves feeling more in control, being more productive, that's really where I see that kick up in motivation, when they're seeing the positive effects from it.
It's interesting as I hear you kind of talk, and I think paying attention to language is so important. It's the CBT kind of part of me that, but like when you're talking about it, like I like, just what you said there just a second ago. You said, I can't do anything else until I get this done. And I think that the power of those words are important. And, and I find that when people fail at it, they're like, well, I'm going to try to get these done.
Right.
Versus like, I can't. Like, now in reality, we all know they can. They can do, they can go and break the rule. But when right. When you listen to elite athletes, when you listen to these executives that are, they use very absolute language. Like, it's, there's not I'm going to try. I think I can get it done. It's no, like, until I do this, I literally can't, like, I'm shackled to my work and I can't do anything else. That as an intervention by itself, I think is super powerful. I mean, I think just, listening to how you describe it, I'm sure you use similar language with, people you work with. It's what I work on all the time. I'm like, you got to talk like that to yourself. You can't use soft language because then you find excuses around it.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, without a doubt. And it's hard to, as we know, depending upon the individual, it's hard to get them to fall in love with the process. I always use that. That's it's a good Kobe Bryant term, right? He talks a lot about falling in love with the process. And, it's hard to get people to do that at times. Again, what I try to accomplish early is any bit of success, any bit of progress. Because that to me is something I really draw on with my clients and get them to see, listen, I don't care if you think this is a big deal or not. This is a huge deal. You came to me feeling down, feeling like you really didn't have things in order. And you're telling me just this week, you just did well on 3 tests you had, where 2 weeks ago, you didn't do well on really any of the tests you had. So, let's celebrate that. Let's recognize that even though you're not feeling like it's that monumental, these baby steps that we're taking are really helping. And that, again, is really impactful for the people that I'm working with.
And I love the language to piggyback off your comment, Ray, about like the importance of language. And I hear, and I have this kind of like these 4 areas that I try to talk about with individuals of that I think can help to inspire motivation, or at least finding it, and whether that interest, competition, urgency, or new and novel experiences. And I hear it in some ways, all of those. It's I can't, and so there's a bit of a like competitiveness, like, hey, like I don't think you can do this. Oh, let me prove you wrong, or that like motivating against themselves, sparking this urgency of, I have this time and I want to use it purposefully, this 25-minute break. And, also how do I get that urgency to get to the next break in these pieces here? And so in all of this, I'm curious of what role you find when someone is inconsistent, because at least that's the thing I run into the most of. We make progress and then they're almost too confident in themselves. They discontinue following the process. They look for the shortcut too soon, and then we're falling back into these old patterns. And it's this inconsistency. And so I know personally, I try to encourage. I want you to have a healthy level of self-doubt. I don't want you to trust your brain that you're going to remember. I want you to let's externalize it, because when you write it down, that's not going to forget. We might forget to look, but it's not going to forget on the page or on your agenda book here. But are there any strategies you have to really help encourage consistency with the interventions? Because the interventions themselves are consistent.
Yeah, Paul, I'm so glad you asked that, because that's an area. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I tell my clients that. I said, listen, we're gonna do this. You're gonna start to feel successful, and then undoubtedly you're gonna be like, you know what, I got this, and you're gonna fall back a little bit. It happens all the time, and so one thing that I do is I talk about that early, right? So I get people to expect that at some point in time those thoughts are going to creep into their mind, and what I tell them is, it's normal. 2, it happens to me on a weekly basis, right? And 3, I always get bit by it. So pay attention to when that thought comes in. That is your red flag that you need to hunker down and work even harder at the system. And the other thing too is, and it's funny, one client comes to mind, I met with not too long ago. He's a college kid. And the first thing he said to me was, not doing well with it. And we talked about it. And I said, okay, tell me what's going on. And he told me, and I said, he's like, I need to get back to it. And I said, listen, you're a freshman in college and you're learning these extremely valuable lessons. I don't want anyone to struggle or fail, but I'm so glad that you had this experience, because I don't need to tell you anything. You're feeling stressed, overwhelmed. You're feeling like you haven't been doing well. You're more capable than that. And you just told me yourself that you need to get back to the habits. That's all I really need. And so we talked about that, and, we laughed a little bit, because I was like, I'm glad. Listen, I'm glad this happened to you. And we've really built from that. And it's funny, since then, I don't really have to encourage him all that much, because again, he's felt that success and also felt what happens when he falls out of habit.
I could not agree more when you're talking, especially that piece happens to me on a weekly basis. Absolutely. And yeah. I think, and, I want to pause for just a moment, because I hear the value of self-disclosure for you with your clients, and how it can really help to, really kind of have them recognize, I'm working with a professional who gets it. And it's not the exact same experience, but it's similar. And, also the value of being able to buy into the process, because it's a process that's being utilized as well. And so, when you said that, it just kind of really, really stuck out to me, of like being able to generate that buy-in, and, hopefully creating that strong relationship, because, it's not this, hey, trust me, but I don't have any experience applying it. It's, trust me, I'm using this process, and, it's not you don't have to be perfect with it. You just have to be consistent with returning to the process. And that's going to be that key. And that's that self-management piece.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things that all kids think, and I certainly did, and, I had this epiphany as I got a little bit older, and I continue to have it, is that like nobody really has it all figured out. Right.
Right.
And kids think, and teenagers think, that like the adults in their world have everything figured out. And that's not true. What everyone sees on Facebook isn't reality. And so I explain that to kids. And yeah, I mean, I find that, from a relationship standpoint and a buy-in standpoint, showing kids that yes, you too make mistakes and you too aren't perfect and have to work at this every day. That's really impactful, and it's really real and honest.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want people thinking that everyone that they're working with or everyone they're seeing that's an adult has everything figured out. Because I certainly know I don't. I mean, just ask my wife; she'll tell you.
Yeah, I think I always go back to my early education. But when I was doing my doctorate, we did work with Albert Ellis, and Ellis's comment was, "We're all fallible human beings," and this idea that I think sometimes that's where kids miss that connection with who's providing the interventions, because sometimes I think people come across like, oh, I have all my shit together and I don't make any mistakes. And I make mistakes every single day. I mean, I don't even think it's a weekly basis. Like, there's always things, but it's the art of recovery that is the key. It's the fact that, yeah, of course I make them, but I've gotten really good at recovering from them. And I think by doing that, I think that's really what you instill in them. And I think such an important process, because I tell kids, you're never going to get it perfect. Like, there's going to be the day, yeah, you can have this great management system and you're probably still one day going to miss an assignment. But then you got a choice. The choice is, do you miss another one the next day, or do you work harder at the system? Like that's where you got to come back to. But yeah, I think that's self-disclosure. I love that piece. And we've done episodes about that in general, like the idea of how important it is to do self-disclosure. I think we can go too far with it, but I think in these example levels, I think super important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
And, as we're talking about executive functioning and also, the emotionality piece, I can't help but wonder, the self-management provides an avenue for control and stability for your clients. Are there any specific interventions that you work with for emotional regulation, and anything that you kind of do to any specific interventions that you find are really effective for this population who struggles with executive functioning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, a lot of it, the framework that I often operate under is a cognitive behavioral framework, right? Now, that doesn't work for all kids, as we know. It doesn't work for all people, as we know. So that's usually my starting point until I recognize that that's not the way to go, usually. I usually start with that. So, a lot of the things that, when we think about someone who's getting frustrated because they're not being successful and then have those underlying executive functioning challenges, their problem solving is like trying to problem solve through a sieve, right? It's really, really hard, and it's super, super difficult for them to get out of. So we'll talk about that, but it will also work on, all right, well, what's going on in your head at this time? And it may be, I can't do this. I stink. I'm a failure. I suck, whatever. So we'll say, okay, cool. So the thought changing part for me doesn't come in then. It's okay. When you recognize that, when those thoughts are coming in and those feelings are happening, what can you do that's going to help you kind of chill out a little bit? So maybe you need to walk away from what you're doing for 10 minutes and you go play with your dog, or go shoot some baskets outside, or go walk around your house and listen to music, whatever it is. And then let's start talking about those thoughts again, right? So that whole I suck, I can't get this, is that true? Do you really suck at everything? Or is it that you're just really frustrated because, you're hitting your max cognitive frustration point right now and it's hard to get around? And so we'll really work on a lot of those things. And again, when it comes to coping skills, I am a huge fan of breathing techniques and things like that. However, kids have a tough time with that sometimes. And so I often utilize other things like distraction techniques and movement. I'll have kids do push-ups. I'll talk about how push-ups help to re-regulate your brain and why. And so I'll focus on some of those coping strategies first. And then as kids start to get more proficient at decreasing their physiological response, that's when I'll start folding in some more of those cognitive behavioral strategies.
And I really appreciate it. And I was curious of some of the interventions that I really encourage. And it follows this very similar model of I encourage like before we really get into this point of challenging our thoughts, take space, soothe or distract, or both soothe and distract and finding something. But, we're not going to be effective in regulating in that moment when we're really already frustrated. So taking space away from it and finding those ways to help just decompress and, reducing that intensity is so valuable and so important. And I guess also the point that I also oftentimes try to, give a warning for, and I do find that it happens, is the space can sometimes lead to avoidance. And so it's, hey, go take that walk, but also making sure you're coming back to it. Like, don't just leave it hanging and don't just kind of, leave it pending and procrastinate with it. And is there any strategies you have there for your clients to, how do we come back and re-engage after we've done some of those coping techniques or using those mechanisms?
Yeah. So Paul, for me, that's where timers and alarms come in, right? So I'll have, and what I tell people is set an alarm that's annoying. Like, don't set it as your typical alarm that you might set to wake up in the morning or throughout the day or whatever. Set something different that's a little bit annoying and loud so that you have no choice but to turn it off and then go return to what you were doing. So that's when I teach people really the effectiveness of setting timers and alarms, making sure that, again, with those mental strategies and those mental rules, when that alarm goes off, I must return to what I was doing, and maximizing that.
I had a teenager that I'm working with, and I'm an alarm guy too. I think it's just, they help me. But it was funny because he came in and he said, well, the alarms haven't been working. So I had to switch it a little bit. And I said, well, how did you switch it? He said, I can't turn the alarm off until I'm back to the place where I need to do my work. So he said, I set this. So the funny part is he sets his alarm to a Barry Manilow song. So he's like, it's an annoying song that he's like his grandmother used to listen to. He doesn't like, it's like Coco Cabana, something like that. And he's just like, yeah. And he's like, so I play it and I'm not permitted to turn it off. So back to that power language till I sit down at my desk and I'm ready to start working. And then I give myself permission to turn it off. And that self-role works. It's, it's like he gets himself back, and it's like, but he's like, I walk through the house, I got to listen to the song the whole way. He says, it makes me walk faster. It's like brilliant. Yeah. It's so, well, Justin, this was great. I mean, I really appreciate you kind of giving kind of these tips. I mean, so many things you said, I kind of gave me some ideas to do as well. So I really appreciate it. As we're kind of wrapping up, we always like to kind of end our episodes with a couple just kind of questions we ask everyone. And one is, if you had one piece of content, it can be a book, a movie, TV show, anything you want, that you would suggest our listeners would watch or read, what would that be? What's the content you would share?
It's an awesome question. I love that. Yeah. So something that I believe it or not, I honestly revisit this often is the Dr. Seuss book, All the Places You'll Go. That to me, I remember reading it to my kids when they were little, and reading it, there were so many epiphanies I had about myself in that book. And that's a book I oftentimes will go back to because, I am someone who doesn't like to be in that, as they say in the book, that waiting place, right? It drives me crazy, and my patience isn't always there. So I oftentimes go back to that book.
Man, Dr. Seuss, that's always a classic. That's great.
Yeah.
That's right. The last question. If you had 3 takeaways to give our listeners that, from kind of the work you do or new clinicians, what's the 3 takeaways you would tell?
Yeah. So takeaway 1, I think, is, just be yourself and show who you truly are, obviously within a boundary. But, to your clients, especially when you're working with kids and teenagers, that buy-in through the relationship is so vital. And the more real you are, the more they will, connect to that and buy in. So that would be my recommendation, number 1. Number 2 is I would say don't overcomplicate the process. I've had, and I've heard from a lot of clients that have been other places where, they might have tried to get different interventional help and they're using these complicated systems or these complicated apps on their phone. And I'm not really, there's a place for those things with some people, but start small, start simple. And oftentimes those things work very, very well and more effectively than some of the things that have more bells and whistles. And then the last thing I would recommend is, meeting people where they are. Oftentimes in a, intervention situation, a counseling situation, I have an idea of where I want to go and where I want to get people. But I have to make sure that that is congruent with where people are at the given day or moment that I'm working with them. And making sure that I'm, identifying that and, slowing myself down is highly effective and way more effective than trying to get them to where I think they need to be in the time frame that I would like them to get there.
Awesome. Hey, Justin, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us.
Truly. And, I was taking down so many different notes and, I'm excited to take them and apply them here in some of my upcoming sessions. And, Justin, if people are interested in following you and hearing about what's going on for you, where can they follow you at, and where can they learn more?
I appreciate that. So, my website is the best place to reach out and contact me. It's solutionsforeducationllc.com. That has a lot of the great work that, myself and members of my practice are doing. And, guys, I can't thank you enough. This has been such an honor, such a fun experience. And someone I'm not trying to suck up here, but the truth of the matter is, no, truly, you're someone who has had such a huge impact in my career and in my life in general. And I'm just so honored to be a part of it today.
Well, I appreciate that. And I feel the same way. It goes both ways. So appreciate that.
Thank you.
And, if you're interested in following Justin, we'll have the link for his website in the show notes, so you can go down there and check that out. If you're interested in hearing more about what's going on for Psyched to Practice, go to our website at www.psychedtopractice.com or following us on all major social media by searching for Psyched to Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well, stay psyched.